In Kingsport, Connecticut, a library card is a status symbol, and a mother's love is performance art. You learn quickly that the perfect white fences are just there to cage the dysfunction. I am Emily Brown. For my entire life, I was the invisible prop in my mother's melodrama cast aside so she could fawn over my brother's endless failures. They missed my master's graduation to watch him bomb at a dive bar, and that was the moment I stopped crying and started plotting. I decided to make them famous, just not in the way they wanted. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The story begins with a diploma and an empty chair. The precise moment I decided to destroy my mother's reputation wasn't during a screaming match or a holiday dinner disaster. It happened in the heavy, humid silence of a university auditorium amidst a sea of black polyester robes and square caps. I was 26 years old, sitting in the front row, reserved for honors students waiting to accept my master's degree in English literature. I was the valedictorian. The speech folded in my lap was about resilience, about the American spirit of carving your own path through the bedrock of adversity. I had written it thinking about the long nights I spent working 3 waitressing jobs to pay for the tuition my parents claimed they couldn't afford. I scanned the audience again, my eyes sweeping the mezzanine where the families sat. I saw proud fathers waving handheld cameras, mothers weeping into tissues, siblings looking bored but present. But in row G, seats 12 and 13 remained stubbornly, conspicuously empty. My phone buzzed against my thigh, hidden beneath the folds of my gown. I shouldn't have checked it, but hope is a treacherous thing. It was a text from my mother, Linda. Todd has a showcase at the Giggle Shack. It's a big break, honey. A scout might be there. We have to support his art. We'll celebrate you later. XOXO. I stared at the screen, the blue light blurring slightly. The Giggle Shack was a dive bar 40 minutes away, known for watered-down beer and sticky floors. Todd was 30 years old. He had been breaking into comedy for a decade, a pursuit that mostly involved him making rude noises into a microphone and calling it satire. He was unemployed, slept on my parents' couch, and had never finished a single thing he started. Yet on the day I was being honored for years of academic rigor, my parents were driving to a basement bar to watch him bomb for an audience of 5 drunks. The dean called my name. I stood up, walked across the stage, and shook his hand. I didn't cry. I didn't scene. I simply realized that my life, my achievements, and my sacrifices were invisible to them. They were characters in a tragedy of their own making, worshipping a son who would never grow up while ignoring the daughter who had already surpassed them. As I accepted the diploma, a cold, crystalline clarity washed over me. I wouldn't beg for their attention anymore. I would use it. I would turn their absurdity into my currency. If they wanted drama, I would give them a masterpiece. 2 years later, I had constructed a life in Kingsport, Connecticut that was as carefully curated as the fiction I wrote. To the town, I was Emily Brown, the quiet, efficient librarian who organized the mystery section and drove a sensible sedan. I lived in a small, tidy apartment downtown, paid my bills early, and attended town council meetings. I was a pillar of quiet, respectable citizenship. But in the early hours of the morning, while Kingsport slept under its blanket of coastal fog, I was someone else entirely. I was E.B. Vance. It had started as therapy, really. I began writing mystery novels centered on psychological deconstructions of dysfunctional families. My debut, The Glass Nursery, had hit the bestseller list within a week. The critics praised my ability to capture the suffocating nuances of maternal narcissism. They didn't know I was simply transcribing my childhood. The checks that deposited into my secret account were substantial enough to buy a house in the Hamptons, but I stayed in Kingsport. I stayed because the game wasn't finished. The irony of my double life was sharp enough to draw blood. My mother, Linda, was obsessed with E.B. Vance. It was the sort of cosmic joke that proved God had a sense of humor. Linda would come into the library, her bracelets jangling, and lean over my desk. "Emily, have you read the new Vance Yet Silent Corridors?" She would ask, her eyes wide with a feigned intellectual depth. The way she writes about betrayal, it just speaks to me. I feel like she understands the burden of being a mother who gives too much. I would smile, stamp her checkout card, and hand her the book I had written on my laptop 3 months prior. It's very popular, Mother. I'm sure you'll love it. She never recognized herself. She never saw that the overbearing martyr complex villainess in Chapter 4 was wearing her favorite scarf and using her exact catchphrases. Linda didn't read to reflect. She read to project. She saw herself as the victim in every story, the noble sufferer, never the architect of the pain. She preened about her literary taste to anyone who would listen, desperate to be seen as a woman of culture in a town that judged you by your reading list. Then came the opportunity for the final act. I had just finished the manuscript for my latest book, The Mother's Masquerade. It was my magnum opus, a direct, scathing allegory of the graduation incident, but transposed into a murder mystery. The villain Lucinda wasn't just a bad mother. She was a monster of neglect who sacrificed her brilliant daughter to feed the ego of her incompetent son, Tad. I decided it was time to merge my two worlds. I told my publisher I wanted to do the exclusive book launch and signing right here at the Kingsport Public Library. The announcement sent a ripple through the town. The Kingsport Mystery Society, a group of formidable local matriarchs, was in a frenzy. Linda naturally had joined the club recently, desperate to climb the social ladder. She called me a week before the event, breathless. "Emily, you won't believe it. I got a ticket, a VIP ticket to the E.B. Vance signing. Mrs. Sterling says it's the event of the season." "That's nice, Mom," I said, cradling the phone between my shoulder and ear as I reviewed the final proofs of the book. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about that night. I have a presentation at the library the same evening. It's a small thing, just some local work I've been doing, but it's important to me. I was hoping you and Dad and maybe even Todd could come watch." The pause on the other end was heavy with dismissal. "Oh, Emily," she sighed, the sound of a woman burdened by her own popularity. "You know we'd love to, but this is E.B. Vance. It's a once-in-a-lifetime thing. We can't miss it. Besides, Todd is going through a rough patch. He needs to get out and be around culture. Maybe you can record your little speech." "It's not a speech, Mom. It's a reveal," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Well, whatever it is, I'm sure you'll do fine. You're always so capable," she said, making competence sound like a consolation prize. "We really have to prioritize this. It's important for the family image to be seen at the right events." "I understand," I said. And I did. I understood perfectly. She was choosing a stranger's celebrity over her daughter's reality, just as she had chosen a dive bar over my degree. But this time, the stranger and the daughter were the same person. This time, her ticket wasn't to a show, it was to her own trial. "Enjoy the signing, Mom. I promise it will be unforgettable." I hung up the phone and looked at the stack of hardcover books sitting on my dining table. The cover of The Mother's Masquerade was glossy and dark, featuring a silhouette of a woman turning her back on a child. I ran my hand over the embossed title. The trap was set. They wanted to support E.B. Vance fine. I would give them exactly what they asked for. Writing The Mother's Masquerade was less like typing a novel and more like compiling a forensic dossier. For 3 months, I sat in my small study, the glow of the monitor the only light in the room, dissecting my family's pathology with the cold precision of a surgeon. I needed the characters to be undeniable. The villain Lucinda couldn't just be a generic bad mother. She had to be a carbon copy of Linda rendered in high-definition text. I gave Lucinda my mother's specific idiosyncrasies, the little tells that she thought went unnoticed. I described the way Lucinda would feign a migraine whenever a conversation shifted away from her, pressing 2 fingers to her left temple and whispering, "The pressure is just too much today." I chronicled her habit of cutting her meat into microscopic surgical squares before eating, a control mechanism she exerted over her dinner plate when she couldn't control the room. I gave Lucinda her catchphrases, specifically the way she would dismiss any criticism with a breathless, "I do it all for love, you know. I am a slave to my heart." Then there was Tad, the fictionalized version of my brother Todd. In the book, Tad was a 30-year-old aspiring influencer who drained his parents' retirement accounts to fund failed ventures. I didn't have to invent much. I simply transcribed reality. I wrote about Tad's entitlement, his belief that the world owed him a living simply because he existed. I wrote a scene where Tad missed his sister's emergency appendectomy because he was waiting in line for limited edition sneakers. It was a slight variation on real life. Todd had actually missed my high school graduation because he was sleeping off a hangover, but the emotional core was identical. The book was a trap baited with their own vanity. I knew Linda wouldn't see herself in the villain because narcissists never look in the mirror, they only look at the audience. But everyone else, everyone who knew us, they would see the resemblance instantly. It was a risky gamble relying on the collective intelligence of the Kingsport community, but I had faith in the town's appetite for gossip. However, the best-laid plans of mice and mystery authors are rarely weatherproof. 2 days before the scheduled signing at the library, the event that was supposed to be the climax of my revenge, the phone rang at 2:00 a.m. It was the landline, a dusty relic I kept specifically for family emergencies, which usually meant Todd needed money. It was my mother. Her voice was pitched to that high, frantic frequency that signaled a crisis of her own invention. "Emily, it's a disaster. It's Todd." I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. "What happened? Is he hurt?" He's in legal trouble," she whispered as if the police were tapping the line. "He crashed the Honda into the mayor's gazebo. They're saying it's a DUI, but you know your brother, he just gets tired. He's sensitive to headlights. He's down at the station now. We have to go get him." "Okay," I said, my mind already racing. "So go get him." We are, she stammered. "But he's devastated, Emily. He's fragile. We can't possibly go to the book signing on Friday. How can I sit there and listen to an author when my baby is suffering? We need to circle the wagons. We need to stay home and support him. I'll have to give my ticket to Mrs. Gable." I felt the blood drain from my face. The entire architecture of my reveal depended on Linda being in the front room. If she wasn't there, the reading would just be a reading. There would be no confrontation, no realization, no justice. She would stay home coddling Todd, wrapping him in the cotton wool of her denial, while I sat on stage alone. It was the graduation scenario all over again. Todd's incompetence was about to eclipse my moment of triumph. "Mom," I said, keeping my voice level. "You've been talking about this signing for months. You bought a new dress. Todd will be out on bail by then. He'll be fine." "You don't understand mother's love, Emily." She snapped the martyr mask, slipping back into place. "When one of your flock is wounded, you don't go to parties. We're canceling." She hung up before I could argue. I sat in the dark, the dial tone humming in my ear. Rage, hot and familiar, bubbled up in my chest. But I wasn't the powerless student anymore. I was E.B. Vance. I plotted murders for a living. Surely I could plot a way to get my brother out of the house. I knew Todd better than Linda did. Linda thought Todd needed love and support. I knew Todd needed attention and flattery. He was a creature of ego, a moth who would fly into any flame if it promised him a spotlight. If Linda wanted to stay home to support him, I needed to make sure Todd didn't want to be supported. I opened my laptop and pulled up a graphic design program. I spent the next 2 hours crafting the perfect lure. It was a heavy cream-colored invitation embossed with gold lettering. Apex Talent Management Exclusive Scout Mixer. I listed the venue as the Velvet Room, a pretentious new lounge that had just opened 2 towns over. The text was designed to trigger every one of Todd's delusions. "We are looking for the next unpolished gem. Comedy, improv, raw charisma. By invitation only." I printed it on expensive cardstock I used for my manuscripts. I found a courier envelope and addressed it to Todd, marking it, "Urgent casting director inquiry." I drove to the next town over at 4:00 a.m. to drop it in a mailbox that would ensure it arrived the next morning. The plan was simple. Todd would receive the invite. The mixer was scheduled for Friday night, the same night as my signing. Todd, believing he was on the brink of discovery, would insist on going. He wouldn't want his mother hovering over him, cramping his style in front of agents. He would force her to go to her boring book thing so he could take the car or an Uber since the Honda was totaled and chase his fame. The next afternoon, I went to the library for my shift. The atmosphere was electric. The staff was busy setting up rows of folding chairs in the main atrium. A large poster of the Mother's Masquerade stood on an easel near the entrance. I was shelving books in the mystery section, keeping my head down, when I heard the distinct click-clack of a cane against the tile floor. "Put those down, Emily. You're shelving them in the wrong order." I turned to see Mrs. Agatha Sterling. At 75, Agatha was the unofficial queen of Kingsport. She had eyes like polished flint and a tongue that could strip paint. As the president of the Kingsport Mystery Society, she wielded more power in this town than the mayor. She was wearing a tweed suit that looked like it could stop a bullet. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Sterling," I said, adjusting the books. "I believe they are alphabetical by author." "Alphabetical is for amateurs," she scoffed, leaning on her silver-tipped cane. "They should be organized by subgenre. Cozies on the left, noir on the right. But never mind that." She stepped closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "The club is buzzing, Emily. Buzzing. We've been analyzing Vance's previous works. Silent Corridors, The Glass Nursery, the syntax. It's distinct." I kept my face neutral, a skill I had perfected over years of family dinners. "Is that so? You think you know who it is?" Mrs. Sterling's eyes narrowed. She tapped the cover of a Vance paperback on the cart. "I don't just think. I deduce. The descriptions of the coastline in The Glass Nursery, she mentions the smell of brine and old money. That is a Kingsport smell, Emily. And the specific references to the library's silent judgment. This author has stood in this room. She has breathed this air." My heart hammered against my ribs. Mrs. Sterling was too smart. If she put the pieces together before the reading, she might blow my cover. "Perhaps the author vacationed here," I suggested. "Perhaps," Agatha said, dragging the word out. She looked at me, really looked at me with a scrutiny that made me feel like I was under a microscope. "Your mother is coming, I hear. Despite the unpleasantness with your brother." I paused. The invite should have arrived by now. "I believe so. She wouldn't miss it." "Good," Agatha said. "Linda has been unbearable lately, quoting this author like scripture. It will be interesting to see her reaction to the real thing. You know, Emily, I've always found it fascinating how some people can read an entire book and never learn how to read the room." She gave me a sharp, knowing smile. "I'll see you Friday. Don't be late. I have a feeling this author is punctual." She turned and walked away, her cane beating a rhythm on the floor. I watched her go, a cold sweat pricking the back of my neck. She knew, or she suspected. Either way, the stakes had just been raised. Later that evening, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Linda. "Change of plans. Todd got an invite to a huge industry mixer, Apex Talent. He insists I go to the book signing so I don't mess up his vibe. Can you believe the luck, 2 stars in the family? See you Friday." I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. The maneuver had worked. Todd's narcissism was a reliable engine. The stage was set. The players were in position. I went to my closet and pulled out the outfit I had bought for the occasion, a simple, elegant black dress, stark and serious. No more hiding behind cardigans. No more hiding behind pseudonyms. Tomorrow, the town of Kingsport would finally meet E.B. Vance, and my mother would finally meet herself. The air in the Kingsport Public Library had changed. Usually it smelled of dust mites, lemon floor wax, and the quiet desperation of students cramming for finals. Tonight, however, it smelled of expensive perfume, freshly printed ink, and anticipation. The main atrium had been transformed. The sturdy oak tables were pushed to the perimeter, replaced by rows of folding chairs that were rapidly filling with the town's elite. At the front, a small stage had been erected, bathed in the warm, focused glow of a spotlight. In the center of that light sat a high-backed velvet armchair and a small side table holding a glass of water and a single sealed copy of The Mother's Masquerade. I stood in the shadows of the reference stack, watching the scene unfold, like a director watching a play from the wings. My heart was a calm, steady drumbeat against my ribs. There was no fear, only the cold, crystalline focus of execution. I smoothed the fabric of my black dress. It was sleek, severe, and expensive, a garment that Emily the librarian would never buy, but E.B. Vance would wear as armor. I scanned the front row. The Kingsport Mystery Society was out in full force, a phalanx of silver hair and sharp eyes, and there right in the center was Linda. My mother looked radiant, or at least she was performing radiance. She was wearing her signature triple-strand pearl necklace, the one she claimed was a family heirloom, but had actually bought at an estate sale in 1998. She was holding court, leaning over to Mrs. Sterling, gesturing animatedly with a copy of my previous book, The Glass Nursery. I could almost hear her voice over the hum of the crowd, probably claiming she had insider knowledge of the author's identity, or perhaps just bragging about how much she resonated with the themes of sacrificial motherhood. Mrs. Sterling sat next to her, upright and rigid as a gargoyle. She held her cane with both hands, her expression unreadable. She wasn't looking at Linda. She was looking at the empty stage, her eyes narrowed in calculation. She checked her watch. It was 7:00 p.m. The library director, a nervous man named Mr. Henderson, who usually sweated through his shirts by noon, stepped up to the microphone. The room fell silent, the rustle of silk and wool settling into a heavy hush. "Ladies and gentlemen," Henderson squeaked, then cleared his throat. "Residents of Kingsport, it is my distinct honor to welcome you to a night of revelation. We have all been captivated by the works of E.B. Vance. Her novels have peeled back the layers of suburban life to reveal the, complexities beneath. Tonight, for the global release of her final masterpiece, The Mother's Masquerade, she has chosen our humble library. Please welcome the author." Henderson gestured to the side. I took a breath, stepped out of the shadows, and walked into the light. The applause started politely, then faltered. A ripple of confusion moved through the room like a wind across a wheat field. People craned their necks, looking past me, expecting someone else to emerge from the stacks. They expected a stranger. They expected a celebrity. Instead, they got the girl who stamped their due dates. I walked to the center of the stage. I didn't rush. I moved with the deliberate predatory grace I had written into my protagonists. I reached the velvet chair but didn't sit immediately. I stood by the microphone, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable, until the confusion curdled into tension. In the front row, Linda was frantically waving her hand at me, a tight, embarrassed smile plastered on her face. She hissed loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear, "Emily, what are you doing? Get down. The author is coming out." She looked around at Mrs. Sterling, laughing nervously. "She's confused. She thinks she's supposed to introduce him. Emily, get off the stage." I looked directly at her. I didn't smile. "Good evening," I said, my voice amplified and steady, echoing off the high ceilings. "I am E.B. Vance." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum. Linda's laugh died in her throat, choking off into a strangled gasp. She blinked, her mouth opening and closing like a fish on a dock. That's not funny, Emily," she whispered, though the microphone picked up nothing but the room's stunned breathing. "Sit down." "I am sitting down," I said. I took the seat in the velvet chair. I picked up the book. "And I am going to read from the final chapter of The Mother's Masquerade." I cracked the spine of the hardcover. The sound was as sharp as a gunshot in the quiet room. I didn't look at the audience anymore. I looked at the pages, but I didn't really need to read them. I knew the words by heart. I had lived them. Chapter 22, I began. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday. Acute appendicitis. The doctors told Lucinda that her daughter Elara needed surgery immediately. It was routine, they said, but urgency was key. Elara lay on the gurney, gripping the cold metal rails, waiting for her mother to sign the consent forms, waiting for her mother to hold her hand. I paused. I looked up. Linda was frozen, her face draining of color. She recognized the setup. It wasn't appendicitis in real life. It had been the graduation, but the emotional architecture was identical. I continued reading, my voice dropping an octave, becoming the cold narrator of the text. But Lucinda wasn't looking at Alara. She was looking at her phone. Her son Tad, 30 years old, soft in the middle and soft in the head, had called. He was at the park. He was going to juggle for a street fair. It was his big break, he said. He needed someone to record it. A murmur went through the crowd. They knew Todd. They knew his big breaks. Lucinda looked at the doctor. I read. She can wait an hour, can't she? She's strong. Alara has always been the resilient one. But Tad needs me. He's fragile. If I'm not there, he'll crumble. And before the doctor could protest, Lucinda grabbed her purse, the one with the gold clasp, the one she bought with Alara's tuition money, and walked out. She left her daughter alone in the pre-op room to watch a grown man throw beanbags in the grass. I turned the page. Alara watched her go. She saw the familiar flash of Lucinda's pearls, 3 strands fake, bought at an estate sale in '98, swinging around her neck as she hurried toward the door. And in that moment, beneath the antiseptic lights, Alara realized the truth. She wasn't a daughter. She was an appliance, a sturdy, reliable appliance that could be unplugged whenever the golden child needed an outlet. I closed the book. The silence in the library was heavy, suffocating. It wasn't just a story anymore. The specific details, the pearls, the estate sale, the fragile son had stripped away the veil of fiction. Every eye in the room shifted from me to the front row. They looked at Linda's neck. They looked at the 3 strands of pearls. They looked at the woman who had spent months bragging about her connection to the author. Linda stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. Her face was a mottled map of red fury and white shock. The embarrassment had bypassed shame and gone straight to defensive rage. "How dare you!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. She pointed a shaking finger at me. "This is lies, all of it. I am a good mother. I have sacrificed everything for you children. How can you sit there and slander me in front of my friends? I am a saint." She looked around the room, desperate for an ally. "You all know me. You know how hard I work. This is a tantrum. She's jealous of her brother. She's always been jealous." The crowd recoiled. The mask had slipped completely. This wasn't the composed socialite. This was the frantic narcissist villain from the pages I had just read. Then slowly, deliberately, Mrs. Agatha Sterling stood up. She didn't look at Linda. She looked at me. She adjusted her tweed jacket and tapped her cane on the floor once, twice, demanding attention. The room focused on her. In Kingsport, Mrs. Sterling was the final court of appeals. A saint. Agatha's voice was dry and sharp, cutting through Linda's hysteria like a razor through silk. "Linda, sit down. You're making a scene, and it's not even a believable one." "Agatha!" Linda gasped, clutching her pearls. "You can't believe this fiction." "Fiction!" Agatha turned to face her, her eyes blazing with cold intelligence. "I was there, Linda, 2 years ago, the day of Emily's graduation. I saw you at the gas station on Route 9. I asked where you were going, assuming you were heading to the university. You told me you were going to the Giggle Shack because Todd was feeling creatively blocked and needed support." Agatha turned back to the audience, her voice rising. "I didn't understand it then. I thought surely I had misheard. Who skips a master's graduation for an amateur comedy set? But now," she gestured to the book in my lap, "now the pieces fit. The pearls. The migraines you fake to get out of charity work. The way you drain this girl's achievements to fuel that boy's delusions. We've all seen it. We just didn't have the text to cite." Linda shrank back, her mouth agape. She looked at the other members of the Mystery Society. They were all looking at her with a mixture of pity and revulsion. They were connecting the dots. The villain in the book club's favorite series was sitting right next to them. Agatha turned her gaze to the stage. She looked me in the eye, and for the first time in my life, I saw genuine respect in her face. "A brilliant narrative structure, my dear," Agatha said, her voice softening just a fraction. "The pacing was exquisite. The characterization was devastatingly accurate. And most importantly," she paused, letting the weight of the words settle over the room, "congratulations on surviving the source material." Agatha began to clap. It was a slow, solitary clap at first. Then the woman next to her joined in. Then the librarian. Then the mayor in the third row. Within 10 seconds, the entire room was on its feet. The applause wasn't just for the book. It was a verdict. It was a communal acknowledgement of the truth. It was a wall of sound that separated me from my mother forever. I sat in the velvet chair watching Linda. She stood alone in the sea of applause, small and exposed. She looked at me, pleading, waiting for me to fix it, to tell them it was just a joke to be the dutiful daughter one last time. I didn't smile. I didn't look away. I simply reached for the glass of water, took a sip, and watched her crumble. The mystery was solved. The masquerade was over. The applause was still ringing in the rafters, a thunderous ovation that felt less like a celebration of literature and more like a public sentencing when my mother broke. Linda didn't make a graceful exit. She didn't wave or offer a stoic nod to her former friends. She scrambled. Clutching her purse to her chest, as if it contained the last shreds of her dignity, she pushed her way through the standing ovation, her face a mask of wet red humiliation. The crowd parted for her not out of respect, but out of the instinctual need to avoid contagion. To be near her was to be near the wreckage of a reputation, and in Kingsport, that was worse than the plague. I watched her go from my perch on the stage, feeling a strange, hollow sort of peace. The monster under the bed had been dragged into the sunlight, and she looked remarkably small. I spent the next hour signing books. The line wound out the door. People didn't just want signatures. They wanted to touch the hand of the woman who had survived the local villain. They whispered congratulations, their eyes darting to the empty seat where Linda had been. I wrote E.B. Vance over and over, the pseudonym, finally feeling like a shield I could set down. By the time the crowd dispersed and the library staff began folding the chairs, the adrenaline was fading, replaced by a cold, sharp fatigue. I gathered my things and walked out to the parking lot, the cool coastal air biting at my skin. I wasn't surprised to see them waiting. A beat-up taxi was idling near the curb, and standing beside my parents' sedan was Todd. He looked disheveled, his stage outfit a blazer with the sleeves rolled up, wrinkled and stained with what looked like latte foam. He was pacing, gesturing wildly at Linda, who was sitting in the passenger seat of the sedan, weeping into her hands. When Todd saw me, he stopped pacing. He didn't look ashamed. He didn't look apologetic. He looked hungry. "You!" he shouted, marching across the asphalt. "You set me up, Apex Talent Management. It was a coffee shop, Emily. The Velvet Bean. It was an open mic night for poetry. I had to follow a teenager reading haikus about her hamster. I bombed because the room wasn't ready for my energy." I stopped, leaning against the side of my car. "The room wasn't ready for you, Todd, because you aren't funny. You never have been." He stopped a few feet away, his eyes darting to the stack of books I was carrying. "And this mom told me. You wrote a book about us. You used my likeness without permission." His anger morphed instantly into greed, a transformation I had seen 1,000 times. He smoothed his hair, a smirk touching his lips. "We're famous, aren't we? This is huge. We can spin this. A reality show, maybe, The Real Family of E.B. Vance. I can be the manager. We can sue for royalties if you don't cut us in." Linda rolled down the window, her face blotchy. "Emily, get in the car. We are going home to discuss this as a family. You can rewrite it. We can issue a press release saying it's fiction. Tell them I was the inspiration for the heroine." The delusion was breathtaking. Even now, staring down the barrel of social exile, she thought she could edit reality. I reached into my tote bag and pulled out a thick manila envelope. It wasn't a manuscript. It was a legal packet I had prepared weeks ago with a top-tier firm in New York. "There will be no rewrites, Mother," I said, my voice cutting through the damp night air. "The ink is dry. And Todd, there will be no reality show." I tossed the envelope to Todd. He caught it, fumbling with the clasp. "What is this?" he asked. "A cease and desist," I said, "and a notification of financial severance, the trust fund you've been draining. It was legally mine, managed by Dad until I turned 25. I let you dip into it because I was too tired to fight, but the audit is complete. You've spent $40,000 of my money on investments that don't exist. That stops tonight. The account is frozen. The credit cards you carry that are linked to my name canceled as of an hour ago. Todd stared at the papers, his mouth hanging open. You can't do that. I'm your brother. I have potential. You have a rap sheet and a tab at a coffee shop, I said. You're 30 years old. Get a job. Linda leaned out the window, her voice shrill. Emily, he is fragile. You are destroying this family over a book. It's just a story. It's a bestseller, I corrected her. And it's the truth. You want it to be immortalized, Mom? You are. You're the villain in the book club's favorite novel. You'll live forever on the shelf right between narcissism and neglect. I got into my car and locked the doors. Todd slammed his hand against the window, screaming something about loyalty, but the sound was muffled, distant. I started the engine, backed out, and drove away. In the rearview mirror, I saw them standing under the flickering sodium light, a woman who loved herself too much, and a son who loved work too little, shrinking into the darkness where they belonged. The fallout was immediate and clinically precise. In a town like Kingsport, social death is not a violent event. It is a silent freezing. The next morning, Linda attempted to maintain her routine. She went to the upscale grocery store on Main Street, the one where the produce is arranged like art and the gossip is fresh. She filled her cart with artisanal cheese and wine, pretending that the previous night hadn't happened. She reached the checkout counter. The cashier was Mrs. Gable, a woman who had played bridge with Linda for 10 years and was a devoted lieutenant of Mrs. Sterling. Linda forced a bright, brittle smile. Good morning, Susan. Lovely day, isn't it? Mrs. Gable didn't look up. She scanned the items in silence. Beep, beep, beep. Susan, Linda tried again, her voice wavering. I was thinking for the bridge tournament next week I could bring my famous tarts. Mrs. Gable stopped scanning. She looked up, her expression as cold as the frozen peas on the belt. The roster is full, Linda. We found a replacement. Someone who aligns with our values. She finished bagging the groceries and pushed them toward the end of the counter without making eye contact. That will be $80. Please move along. You're holding up the line. Linda fled the store, leaving the cart behind. But the final blow arrived via the postal service 2 days later. It was a heavy cream-colored envelope addressed to Mrs. Linda Brown. Inside was a single sheet of cardstock embossed with the seal of the Kingsport Mystery Society. The handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, angular, and penned in fountain ink. Dear Linda, we have finished our discussion of the Mother's Masquerade. The consensus is that the antagonist is too realistic to be comfortable in our parlor. As such, your membership is revoked, effective immediately. We find that while we enjoy reading about mysteries, we prefer not to associate with the tragedies that inspire them. Regards, Agatha Sterling, President. It was a polite, formal execution. Linda had been erased from the social register. The phone stopped ringing. The dinner invitations evaporated. She was a ghost in her own town, haunting a house she could no longer afford to keep bound to a son she had ruined, while I packed my bags for a future that finally belonged to me. The for sale sign planted in the front lawn of my parents' colonial estate was tasteful, a wooden arm with gold lettering, but the desperation behind it was gaudy. It had taken exactly 3 weeks for the house of cards to collapse once the wind started blowing. The financial ruin of the Brown family wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow, agonizing leak. Todd's little escapade with the Honda and the mayor's gazebo hadn't just been a social faux pas. It was a legal catastrophe. There were fines, restitution fees for the historic structure, and a lawyer who charged $400 an hour to keep Todd out of a jumpsuit. Naturally, my parents had turned to me. They sat me down at the dining table, the wood scarred from years of aggressive cutlery use, and presented me with the bill as if it were a menu. We need to pull together, my father had said, his voice trembling with the first real fear I'd ever heard in it. The family needs a bailout, Emily. Your royalties. Surely you can spare a bridge loan. I had looked at them, really looked at them, and saw not parents but strangers who owed me a childhood. I'm not a bank, I had replied, my voice calm and final. And I'm not a safety net. I'm an author. And the only thing I'm writing today is a check for my own movers. I refused to pay a cent. Without my capital to cushion the blow, the math finally caught up with them. They were leveraged to the hilt, maintaining a lifestyle designed to impress people who had now blocked their numbers. The house had to go. The move was a funeral procession for their egos. They were relocating to a split-level rental in a town 3 hours inland, a place where the country club was a driving range behind a gas station, and the library was a single room in the municipal basement. It was a place where nobody knew Linda Brown, which meant she would have no audience for her performances. She would just be a woman in a small house alone with a husband who was too tired to work and a son who was too lazy to try. Todd took the fall the hardest. Stripped of the investor title and the allowance that fueled it, reality hit him with the force of a freight train. He stood in the driveway on moving day, holding a box of his participation trophies and unfinished screenplays. He looked smaller, the swagger deflated. He had been forced to take a job at a logistics warehouse to pay his probation fees. The irony was delicious. He would be spending his days packing boxes, quite possibly shipping copies of The Mother's Masquerade to paying customers. He was finally part of the literary world, just not in the way he had imagined. He didn't say goodbye to me. He just glared, his eyes filled with the dull resentment of a man who realizes the world doesn't grade on a curve. I didn't stay to watch the moving truck pull away. I had my own closure to attend to. My apartment was empty, the keys left on the counter. I had one final stop before I left Kingsport for good. I met Mrs. Agatha Sterling at the Gilded Leaf, a tea shop that smelled of bergamot and old money. She was sitting at a corner table, her cane resting against the chair, a pot of Earl Grey steaming in front of her. She looked timeless, a monument to a specific kind of New England steel that I had come to respect, if not entirely like. When I approached, she didn't smile, but her eyes crinkled at the corners. "You're late," she said, pouring a second cup without looking up. "I assume you were watching the empire crumble." "Something like that," I said, sliding into the seat opposite her. "The house is sold. They're gone." Agatha took a sip of tea, her pinky finger extended. "Good. Kingsport has a way of correcting its errors eventually. Your mother was a fascinating error, Emily. A case study in what happens when vanity outpaces ability. But you—" She set the cup down with a delicate clink. "You have a sharp pen, sharper than I gave you credit for." She reached into her handbag and pulled out a long velvet box. She slid it across the table. "I have no children, Emily. My husband left me nothing but a trust fund and a headache. I have decided that I prefer to leave my legacy to those who can actually construct a sentence." I opened the box. Inside lay a vintage Mont Blanc fountain pen, its barrel black resin, the nib gold and iridium. It was an instrument of serious intent. It was worth more than Todd's car. "Write the next one," Agatha commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. "But get out of the domestic sphere. It's too small for you now. I suggest a murder on a cruise ship. Enclosed spaces, wealthy suspects, nowhere to run. I need a vacation, and I prefer to take them vicariously." I picked up the pen, feeling its weight. It felt like a torch passing. "Thank you, Agatha. I'll send you the first draft." "You'd better," she said, shooing me away with a wave of her hand. "Now go. You have a life to live, and I have a book club to restructure. We need a new treasurer." I walked out of the tea shop and into the bright, crisp afternoon. My car was waiting at the curb, a sleek charcoal gray SUV with leather seats and a sound system paid for by the misery of my childhood. I threw my bag into the passenger seat and climbed in. The engine purred to life, a low, confident growl. I drove through the center of Kingsport one last time. I passed the library where the poster for The Mother's Masquerade still stood in the window, a monument to my liberation. I passed the grocery store where Linda had been shunned. I passed the high school where I had been ignored. Every corner held a ghost, but they didn't haunt me anymore. They were just setting details, background texture for a story I had finished telling. As I merged onto the highway, picking up speed, I glanced at the rearview mirror. The town of Kingsport shrank, the church steeples and slate roofs blurring into a watercolor smudge of gray and green. The sun was setting ahead of me, painting the sky in violent streaks of purple and gold. I didn't know exactly where I was going, maybe New York, maybe London, maybe a cabin in the Rockies. It didn't matter. The road ahead was blank, a fresh page waiting for ink. I reached over and touched the passenger seat where the vintage pen lay in its velvet box. I smiled. My family had wanted a tragedy. I had given them one, but for me, for E.B. Vance. This was just the prologue. I pressed the accelerator and the coast disappeared behind me. The rearview mirror was empty. The story was done. And so the final page turns on the Brown family's deception. Sometimes the most satisfying justice isn't found in a courtroom, but in the quiet dignity of walking away. If you enjoyed Emily's journey from overlooked daughter to celebrated author, please consider subscribing for more tales of retribution. Tell us, would you have exposed your family the same way? We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Ashes of Revenge. We'll see you next time.